Everyone treats SpongeBob as a dumb kid show, a sponge who flips patties and laughs too loud. Nothing deeper going on down there. A real marine biologist built every inch of that world, down to the science. In this video, we break down everything people missed about Spongebob Squarepants. Section 1. The marine biologist who never meant to make a cartoon. Most people who grew up watching Spongebob Squarepants know the character as a goofy yellow sponge who flips patties and laughs at his own jokes. Almost nobody who watched the show as a kid knew that the man who built this entire world spent years of his life studying real ocean creatures before he ever drew a single cartoon. Steven Hillenburg did not start out wanting to make television. He started out wanting to understand the sea. Hillenburg was born on August 21, 1961, at an army post in Lawton, Oklahoma, where his father, Kelly Hillenburg Jr., worked for the United States military. Not long after his birth, his father left military work and became a draftsman and designer in the aerospace industry, and the family moved to Orange County, California. His mother, Nancy, taught visually impaired students, work that depended on patience and finding creative ways to explain things without relying on sight. Stephen had a younger brother named Brian, who eventually followed their father into aerospace design as well. Stephen had no real memory of life in Oklahoma. As far as he was concerned, he grew up entirely in Anaheim, close enough to the coast that the ocean became a constant part of his childhood. There is something fitting about this family setup, even though nobody planned it that way. A father who worked in exact technical design, a mother who taught by finding creative paths around a missing sense, a son who would grow up to spend years teaching marine biology using cartoon drawings to make complicated ocean ideas stick in people's minds. None of it was intentional, but the mix of precise thinking and patient creative teaching sits right at the center of who Hillenburg became. His fascination with the ocean shows up in small details from early childhood. As a boy exploring tide pools near his home, he had a habit of bringing home creatures and objects that caught his interest. Most of these should have stayed exactly where he found them. Once removed from their environment, they often died and started smelling terrible, much to the annoyance of the rest of the household. This was not a scientist carefully studying specimens. This was a kid who could not resist grabbing something strange and interesting and holding on to it, even when it caused problems later. That same instinct, wanting to hold on to something odd because it fascinated him, shows up again throughout his life, just aimed at different things as he got older. His interest in drawing started around the same time as his interest in the ocean. His very first drawing as a small child was of an orange slice. It is a small detail, almost forgettable, but it shows that his instinct to study ordinary objects closely and put them onto paper existed long before any plan involving cartoons or careers. A major turning point in his fascination with the sea came from watching documentary films made by the French oceanographer Jacques Cousteau. Cousteau's underwater footage introduced Hillenburg to a hidden world beneath the surface of the ocean that he had no idea existed before seeing it on screen. He later described these films as giving him a window into that world, one that regular life on land never could have shown him. This was not a small passing interest. Cousteau stayed one of his biggest influences well into adulthood, mentioned in the same breath as comedians and animators whenever Hillenburg talked about what shaped his sense of humor and creative outlook. Speaking of comedians, this is a part of his background that rarely gets attention. Long before building a show about a sponge and a starfish getting into ridiculous situations, Hillenburg grew up admiring physical comedy performers from decades earlier. He often named Charlie Chaplin, Buster Keaton, and the duo Laurel and Hardy as major influences on his sense of humor, along with the Three Stooges, W.C. Fields, and Jerry Lewis. He also pointed to Jim Henson's puppet work and the strange, exaggerated style of Pee Wee Herman's television show. These influences explain a lot about the tone he eventually built into his own series. The comedy in SpongeBob leans heavily on simple, physical situations, characters falling down, getting hurt in harmless but exaggerated ways, and reacting with wide, dramatic expressions rather than clever wordplay. That style did not appear out of nowhere. It came from decades of classic comedy Hillenburg studied and loved as a kid. His artistic influences were just as varied. He pointed to classic newspaper comic artists like George Harriman and E.C. Segar, along with the modern comic strip work of Bill Watterson. He named animators such as Max Fleischer, Bob Clampett, and Chuck Jones, three figures closely tied to the golden era of American cartoon shorts, as well as Jay Ward, known for several classic animated television properties. He specifically mentioned the 1968 animated film Yellow Submarine, built around the music of a famous British rock band, as a visual influence. Modern animation mattered to him too, and he cited Matt Groening, creator of a long-running prime-time animated sitcom, as one of the artists whose work he respected. All of these influences sat inside Hillenburg for years, without much practical use, while he pursued a career centered entirely on science. As a teenager, well before any of this creative background turned into a job, he took ordinary summer work like a lot of kids his age. For several summers after finishing high school, he worked as a fry cook and a lobster boiler at a seafood restaurant in Maine. It was simple, repetitive kitchen work, the kind of job nobody expects to matter later in life. But small details from it stuck with him permanently. His manager at the restaurant had a strong regional accent and a personality memorable enough that Hillenburg later based a certain money-loving restaurant owner directly on him, adding extra greed to the character purely to make him more entertaining. The frying station itself, the long hours standing over hot oil, the repetition of doing the same task again and again without complaint, eventually became the daily routine of a certain sponge who never seems to tire of his job, no matter how many times he does it. After high school, Hillenburg enrolled at Humboldt State University in Northern California and pursued a degree centered on natural resource planning, with a specific focus on marine resources. While studying science, he kept taking art classes on the side, refusing to give up the creative half of his interests, even while working toward a science degree. In 1984, he graduated with that degree in hand, and for a while, his path looked settled. Science felt like the safer, more sensible choice, and art felt like something that might not pay the bills on its own. Following graduation, Hillenburg took a job that placed him directly where his two passions would eventually meet, even if he did not realize it at the time. He became an instructor at the Orange County Marine Institute in Dana Point, California, an organization known today as the Ocean Institute. There, he taught visitors and students about tide pool ecology, the history of sailing along the California coast, and the many ways ocean animals adapt to survive. This was not a brief stop before animation. Hillenburg worked in this role for several years during the mid to late 1980s, building a genuine career as a marine science educator, not a hobbyist who happened to know a little about the ocean. To make his lessons easier for students to follow, Hillenburg began creating illustrated materials featuring cartoon versions of the animals he taught about. Turning sea creatures into characters with faces and personalities made complicated ecological ideas easier for younger students to understand and enjoy. This teaching tool, made purely to help with classroom lessons, would later grow into something enormous, but at the time it was simply a practical way to keep his students engaged. Even as this side project grew more detailed, Hillenburg still identified mainly as a science educator rather than an artist chasing a career in entertainment. That began to shift once his interest in drawing pulled harder than his interest in staying in marine science full-time. He made the decision to go back to school. this time to study animation directly, enrolling in the experimental animation program at the California Institute of the Arts. He studied under a teacher named Jules Engel, a respected figure in experimental animation, who reportedly accepted Hillenburg into the program largely because of how impressed he was with the comic Hillenburg had already made for his marine biology students. In other words, the very teaching materials Hillenburg built simply to help students understand tide pools were strong enough on their own to help him get into a serious animation program. While studying at Cal Arts, Hillenburg made 2 short animated films that showed how wide his creative range really was. One, called The Green Beret, was a silly, over-the-top short about a physically disabled Girl Scout with enormous fists who ends up wrecking entire neighborhoods while trying to sell cookies. The tone was absurd and cartoonish, clearly pulling from the classic comedy he grew up admiring. His other film, and his thesis project for the program, took a completely different direction. Titled Wormholes, it ran about 7 minutes and explored ideas connected to Albert Einstein's theory of relativity through animation, blending science with a more poetic visual style. He described it in a funding proposal as a poetic animated film built around relativistic phenomena, showing that even while training as an animator, he had not set aside his interest in serious scientific ideas. The film won an award for Best Concept at the Ottawa International Animation Festival in 1992, and it was at that same festival where Hillenburg met an animator named Joe Murray, a connection that would open the door to his first real job in television animation. After graduating from Cal Arts with a Master of Fine Arts degree in 1992, Hillenburg went to work for Joe Murray, who had created a Nickelodeon show called Rocko's Modern Life, about a wallaby navigating everyday life in a strange town. On that show, Hillenburg worked as a director, a writer, and a storyboard artist, learning the practical side of how television animation gets made, from pitching ideas to seeing them through to a finished episode. This is where he built the professional relationships and production knowledge that would later let him pitch and build a show entirely his own. What makes Hillenburg's path unusual is not simply that a scientist became an artist. Plenty of people change careers. What makes it unusual is how directly his years as a science educator fed into the show he eventually made. The frying job in Maine gave him a boss to base a character on and a job to hand his main character. The years teaching tide pool ecology gave him a working knowledge of real sea creatures, accurate enough to base an entire underwater town on. The illustrated teaching materials he made for his students gave him early character designs he would return to years later. None of it was wasted. Every detour through classrooms, seafood restaurants, and animation school turned out to be preparation for something nobody, including Hillenburg himself, could have predicted at the time. By the time he finished his run on Rocko's Modern Life, Hillenburg had already unknowingly gathered nearly everything he needed to build Bikini Bottom. He had the science, he had the personalities, he had a job that fit perfectly into the world he would eventually create. The only piece still missing was going back to that old teaching comic and turning it into something far bigger than a handout for a handful of students learning about the tide. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That missing piece did not stay missing for long, and what happened to that old comic book next explains where every character in Bikini Bottom actually came from. Section 2. The comic book nobody was supposed to see. Back when Stephen Hillenburg was still teaching marine biology at the Orange County Marine Institute, he had no plan for his teaching materials to end up anywhere near a television screen. The comic he made, called The Intertidal Zone, existed only to help a group of students understand tide pool animals a little better. It was never printed for stores. It was never meant to travel outside a classroom. Yet somehow, this small, unpublished teaching tool became the seed for one of the most recognized cartoons ever made. and the path it took to get there involved a chain of small decisions that could easily have gone another way. The turning point came once Hillenburg had already left teaching behind and moved into animation. While working at Nickelodeon on Rocko's Modern Life, a co-worker named Martin Olson came across pages from the intertitle zone and immediately saw something worth developing further. Olson strongly encouraged Hillenburg to turn the comic into a full animated series of its own, rather than letting it stay buried as an old teaching aid from a job he had already moved on from. This kind of encouragement mattered a great deal, because Hillenburg was, at that point, still relatively new to the world of professional animation. Having someone already established at Nickelodeon push him toward developing his own idea gave him a reason to take the comic seriously as something more than a personal keepsake from his teaching years. Around this same period, another important person entered the picture almost by accident. Derek Dryman, a storyboard artist working on Rocko's Modern Life, happened to overhear Hillenburg talking about the idea for a new show built around sea creatures. Rather than letting the conversation pass by, Dryman chased Hillenburg down the hallway afterward to ask if he could be involved in developing it. This was not a formal audition or a planned hiring decision. It was one animator excited enough about an idea he overheard in passing that he ran after its creator to ask for a spot on the team. Dryman ended up playing an important role in shaping the show during its earliest stages, working closely with Hillenburg as the concept moved from a rough idea towards something that could actually be pitched to a network. One of the most important things Hillenburg and Dryman worked on together before any pitch meeting happened was figuring out exactly how the main character should behave. This was not something they guessed at randomly. The two of them spent real time watching footage of comedians and characters they felt matched the personality they wanted for their Sponge. According to Dryman, they based the character's personality primarily on the comedian Jerry Lewis, known for his exaggerated, high-energy physical comedy, along with Stan Laurel, one half of the classic comedy duo Laurel and Hardy, whose innocent, easily confused screen persona Hillenburg had admired since childhood. They also looked to Pee Wee Herman, the character created by Paul Rubens, known for his childlike enthusiasm and strange, exaggerated reactions to everyday situations. Blending these three influences together gave the character at the center of the new show a very specific kind of energy: upbeat, easily excited, a little naive, and endlessly optimistic, even when things around him were falling apart. By 1997, the idea had developed enough that Hillenburg was ready to pitch it directly to Nickelodeon executives. This is where the story takes an unusual turn compared to how most television pitches typically happen. Rather than walking into a room with only a folder of drawings or a short verbal pitch, Hillenburg brought something far more hands-on. He arrived with a small homemade aquarium filled with models of the characters he had designed, and he presented the entire concept the way a marine biologist might present real research findings, treating Bikini Bottom almost like a location he had actually studied and observed. This approach fit perfectly with who Hillenburg actually was. He was not simply performing the role of a scientist for effect. He had spent years as a real marine educator, and that background showed clearly in how seriously and carefully he explained the fictional ecosystem he had built. The executives in the room responded strongly to this presentation, in large part because it was clear the person pitching the idea already understood the world he wanted to build down to small details, rather than pitching a vague concept he hoped to figure out later. Alongside this presentation, Hillenburg had already put together a detailed pitch Bible, a written and illustrated document meant to explain the show's world, characters, and tone to people at the network who would decide whether to move forward with it. This document included descriptions of the setting, background paintings showing what different characters' houses looked like, and a section explaining the basic appeal of the show, focused on its tropical underwater setting, its big-hearted lead character, and its cast of ocean-dwelling friends. The pitch Bible even included an illustration of the main cast members together, showing the Sponge, his starfish neighbor, his octopus neighbor, his boss's daughter, his squirrel friend, and the tiny villain who would spend the show trying to steal a secret formula. Interestingly, the final page of this pitch Bible included a description of Hillenburg himself, paired with a photograph of him wearing a pair of homemade glasses built out of an actual sponge. A small, playful touch that captured the same spirit of humor running through the show itself. After the initial pitch, Nickelodeon gave feedback that led to at least one significant addition to the cast. The network wanted the show's main character to be someone still learning and growing, closer to a student than a fully settled adult, and asked for the character to attend some kind of school within the show. In response to this note, Hillenburg added a new character to later drafts of the pitch Bible, a pufferfish driving instructor who would go on to run a boating school. This character eventually became a permanent part of the show, appearing regularly as the frustrated but dedicated teacher trying, usually without success, to help the main character pass his boat driving test. It is worth pointing out how much of the show's eventual shape came directly out of small notes and adjustments made during this pitching process, rather than springing fully formed from Hillenburg's imagination in one single burst of inspiration. The show that eventually aired was shaped by a real back and forth between one very determined creator and the network that would eventually put it on air. Once the show moved from pitch Bible into actual production, another layer of the project came into focus. One that connects directly back to Hillenburg's years of real scientific training. Nearly every major character in the show is built around an actual sea creature, and the choices behind these designs were rarely random. Take Squidward, the perpetually irritated neighbor who works alongside the main character at the restaurant. Despite having the word squid built directly into his name, Squidward is not a squid at all. He is an octopus. His large, rounded head and overall shape closely match the appearance of a giant Pacific octopus, a real species found along the coasts of places like Alaska, California, and Japan, capable of living in shallow tide pools as well as far deeper water. The confusion around his name traces back to a practical animation decision made early in development. Real octopuses have 8 arms, but the animators felt that drawing and animating 8 separate limbs consistently across every episode would be far too difficult and time-consuming. Instead, they gave the character only 6 limbs, a small but deliberate compromise between accuracy and how manageable the character would be to draw over and over again. As for the name itself, an early alternative under consideration would have called him something built directly around the word octopus, but according to his voice actor, that option simply did not sound right out loud, so the crew settled on Squidward instead, accepting that the name would technically describe the wrong animal in exchange for something that felt more fitting. Sandy Cheeks presents an entirely different kind of scientific detail, one that goes against the underwater setting rather than blending into it. Sandy is a squirrel, and squirrels do not naturally live underwater in any form. Her brown coloring and her accent point toward a specific real species, the fox squirrel, an animal found across parts of the United States, including Texas, which matches Sandy's own background in the show. Since squirrels breathe air rather than water, the show handles this scientific mismatch directly, instead of ignoring it. Sandy wears a full diving suit and lives inside a dome filled with air rather than water. A design choice that acknowledges her biology honestly, rather than pretending a land mammal could simply breathe underwater, like the fish and other sea creatures around her. This detail reflects the same instinct that shaped so much of Hillenburg's approach to the show. Even inside a completely absurd cartoon world, the underlying rules of real biology still mattered enough to build a specific piece of technology and location around solving the problem correctly, rather than glossing over it. Mr. Krabs offers a simpler but still accurate detail tied to his species. He is a crab, and real crabs are capable of moving between land and water, spending time in both environments depending on the type of crab and where it lives. This lines up naturally with a character who runs a restaurant, manages money, and moves around Bikini Bottom constantly without any of the same air-related problems Sandy faces. Plankton, the tiny green villain constantly scheming to steal the secret formula behind the show's famous fast food sandwich, is based on copepods, a real type of extremely small ocean organism that lives throughout saltwater environments around the world and feeds on smaller organisms called phytoplankton. Copepods are a genuine and important part of real ocean food chains, and giving the show's primary antagonist this kind of background ties his tiny size directly to a real biological category rather than inventing a made-up type of creature purely for the sake of the story. Not every detail in the main cast lines up quite so neatly, and the show does not pretend otherwise. Pearl, the teenage daughter living with Mr. Krabs, is a whale, despite her father clearly being a crab rather than any kind of whale himself. This mismatch is treated as a simple, accepted detail of the show's world, rather than something requiring an explanation. Similar to how cartoon logic in general allows for family relationships that would not make sense under real biological rules. The show generally leans towards scientific accuracy when it strengthens a joke or a character detail, as seen with Squidward, Sandy, Mr. Krabs, and Plankton, while allowing itself the freedom to bend those same rules elsewhere purely for comedic or storytelling reasons, as seen with Pearl's family situation. All of this character design work eventually led to the show's first appearance in front of an actual audience. The pilot episode, titled Help Wanted, aired on Nickelodeon on May 1st, 1999. This episode introduced viewers to nearly the entire core cast at once, including the main sponge character, his starfish neighbor, his grumpy octopus coworker, and his miserly crab boss, all interacting for the very first time on screen in the exact roles that would carry the show forward for decades. Everything that came before this moment, the old teaching comic drawn for a handful of marine biology students, the encouragement from a coworker who happened to spot old pages from that comic, the storyboard artist who chased Hillenburg down a hallway after overhearing a conversation, the careful study of classic comedians to shape a personality, the homemade aquarium brought into a pitch meeting, and the detailed character work rooted in real marine biology fed directly into those first 20-some minutes that aired on a random Saturday in May. What makes this origin story stand out is how little of it followed a traditional, polished path from idea to finished show. Nearly every major piece of Bikini Bottom traces back to something practical: a teaching tool, a summer job, a hallway conversation, a network note asking for a school setting, or a simple animation limitation around drawing too many limbs. None of these individual pieces looked significant on their own at the time they happened. Only when placed together, years later, does the full picture come into focus, showing how directly connected Hillenburg's background in real marine science was to nearly every creative decision behind the show's earliest design. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. There is still one detail from this entire origin story that gets glossed over constantly, even by people who already know most of what has been covered so far. The show almost carried a completely different name into that first broadcast, and the reason it did not says something surprising about just how close the entire project came to running into a legal problem before it ever had the chance to reach television at all. Section 3. The name almost got him sued. Most people watching Spongebob Squarepants today have no idea that the show almost never carried that name at all. And even fewer know that years after the show became a massive hit, Stephen Hillenburg and Nickelodeon ended up standing in an actual courtroom defending the very existence of the character against someone claiming to have invented him first. The path from an early working title to the name everyone knows today, and the legal fight that came years later over ownership of the character himself, forms one of the more overlooked chapters in the show's entire history. When Hillenburg first began developing his idea into a real television pitch, the main character did not carry the name SpongeBob at all. During the earliest stages of development, and even into the production of the pilot episode, the show carried a working title built around a different name entirely. The character was called Spongeboy, and the show itself was originally going to be titled Spongeboy Ahoy. This title fit the tone Hillenburg was going for: playful, a little old-fashioned, and tied to the ocean setting in an obvious way. Early concept art, character descriptions, and pitch documents from this period all reference the character under this original name, and for a while, everyone working on the project assumed this was simply what the show would be called once it reached television. That plan fell apart once Hillenburg pitched the show to Nickelodeon and moved further into development. Somewhere along the way, it became clear that the name Spongeboy was already in use, attached to a real, existing mop product sold under that exact name. This created an immediate problem. A cartoon show cannot use a name that already belongs to another product on store shelves without running into a direct trademark conflict, since trademark law exists specifically to prevent two different products or brands from using the same name in a way that might confuse customers about which company made which item. Rather than risk a legal fight before the show had even aired a single episode, Hillenburg made the decision to change the character's name entirely. This is where the now familiar name Spongebob Squarepants actually came together, and the reasoning behind it involved more thought than most people realize. Hillenburg wanted to keep the word sponge somewhere in the character's name, since removing it entirely risked confusing young viewers about what the character actually was. Without a clear reference to the word sponge built into the name, there was a real concern that children watching the show might mistake the character for a different kind of household object entirely. Specifically, a block of cheese, given his yellow color and rectangular shape. Keeping the word sponge directly in the name solved this problem cleanly, making sure nobody watching would be confused about what kind of object or creature the character was supposed to represent, even before learning anything else about him. The second half of the new name came from a different, more playful instinct. Adding the word Squarepants gave the character a full name that sounded a little ridiculous on its own, matching the overall tone of the show perfectly. It is worth noting that the character's original design was always based on a kitchen sponge, rather than a natural sea sponge, specifically because Hillenburg felt a natural sponge, which tends to be soft and shapeless, would not be nearly as funny or visually interesting as a stiff, perfectly rectangular kitchen sponge. Once the show settled on this rectangular sponge design, giving the character the last name Squarepants fit naturally, tying his personality-driven design directly into his full name. Under the original working title, the character had been planned without any last name at all, so this addition also solved a second problem, giving the character a complete name rather than just a first name paired with a species description. This name change might have seemed like a minor administrative fix at the time, a simple adjustment made to avoid a conflict with an unrelated mop company. In hindsight, it turned out to be one of the more important decisions made during the show's early development, since the name Spongebob Squarepants eventually became one of the most recognized character names in modern entertainment, appearing on merchandise, in multiple languages, and across decades of episodes, movies, and stage productions. None of that would have happened under the original name, and the show could easily have run into a public and embarrassing trademark dispute with a cleaning product company if the issue had not been caught and fixed before the pilot aired. While this early trademark concern got resolved quietly and without any real legal fallout, a much bigger legal challenge showed up years later, well after the show had already become a major success. In 2007, a man named Troy Walker filed a lawsuit against Nickelodeon and Steven Hillenburg directly, accusing them of stealing the entire concept of SpongeBob from a character he claimed to have created himself years earlier. Walker's lawsuit demanded an extraordinary amount of money, $1.6 billion, based on the claim that he had originally created a character named Bob Spongy back in 1991, years before Spongebob Squarepants ever aired on television. According to Walker's version of events, he had created a 4-panel comic strip featuring Bob Spongy, describing the character as an unemployed sponge with his own storyline involving a wife and daughter. Walker claimed he sold small novelty versions of this character, made by drawing a face onto an actual kitchen sponge and attaching small plastic eyes, packaged together with a tiny printed comic strip explaining the character's situation. He stated that he had run advertisements for this product in a real newspaper during the early 1990s, and he pointed to these old advertisements as proof that his sponge character existed well before Hillenburg's SpongeBob ever appeared anywhere. Walker's case rested almost entirely on the argument that the similarities between his character and SpongeBob were too obvious to be a coincidence. Both characters were sponges. Both were given human-like personalities, including families and daily struggles. Both were, at least on the surface, presented in a lighthearted, comedic way. Based on these surface-level similarities, Walker argued that Nickelodeon and Hillenburg must have seen his earlier creation and copied the basic idea without permission or credit, and he pointed to a later SpongeBob episode with a similar-sounding title as further proof, treating this as further evidence that his original work had somehow made its way into the show's writing process. The case moved forward as Walker versus Viacom International, with Viacom being the parent company connected to Nickelodeon at the time. Walker initially filed the complaint, acting as his own representative, before a law firm eventually took over handling the case on his behalf. Throughout the proceedings, Nickelodeon's side maintained publicly that the claim had no real basis, describing it as a baseless accusation rather than a serious legal threat, though the company avoided commenting in detail while the case remained active in court. When the court finally examined the actual evidence behind Walker's claims, several serious problems emerged that ultimately doomed his entire case. The most significant issue involved timing and documentation. Walker claimed to have created his character in 1991, but he did not officially register a copyright for Bob Spongy until 2003, a gap of more than a decade between his claimed date of creation and any official legal record proving that creation date. Even more damaging to his case, this copyright registration did not happen until 4 years after SpongeBob Squarepants had already been airing on television, meaning there was no independent, verified proof from before the show's premiere that could confirm Walker's version of events actually happened the way he described it. On top of the missing paperwork, the court noted that Walker's account of his own character's history relied heavily on his personal recollection, rather than solid, provable evidence. Where Hillenburg's side was able to present clear documentation showing when and how SpongeBob was actually developed, Walker's side largely depended on his own memory of events from more than a decade earlier, without the kind of paper trail needed to hold up against a serious legal challenge. Meanwhile, Nickelodeon's legal team presented a very different and far more solid set of evidence. They demonstrated clearly that Hillenburg had created his own version of an anthropomorphic sponge character back in 1989, specifically through the character Bob the Sponge, who appeared in the Intertidal Zone, the educational comic Hillenburg made while still working as a marine biology teacher. This detail turned out to be enormously important once the court compared timelines directly. Hillenburg's Sponge character existed on paper 2 full years before Walker even claims to have created his own separate Sponge character in 1991. Rather than SpongeBob being copied from Walker's idea, the court found that Hillenburg's own original Sponge character predated Walker's claimed creation entirely, undercutting the entire basis of the lawsuit before getting into any deeper comparison between the two characters. Beyond simply looking at who came up with an anthropomorphic Sponge character first, the court also directly compared the two characters to judge how similar they actually were beyond the surface level. The ruling pointed out that both characters sharing the name Bob was not by itself meaningful evidence of copying, since Bob is an extremely common name used constantly across countless unrelated characters, stories, and real people. The court specifically noted that beyond both characters technically being rectangular, cartoonish sponges given human-like arms and a name that included Bob, the actual details setting each character apart, their personalities, their storylines, their specific designs, showed far less real overlap than Walker's lawsuit tried to claim. Based on this combination of weak documentation, a clear earlier creation date already established by Hillenburg, and a comparison showing the two characters were less alike than presented, the court ultimately ruled firmly in favor of Hillenburg and Nickelodeon, dismissing Walker's massive financial claim entirely. This case rarely comes up when people discuss the show's history, largely because it ended in a clear, uncomplicated legal win for Hillenburg's side, rather than dragging on or resulting in any kind of settlement or compromise. Yet it represents a genuinely serious moment in the show's background, a real lawsuit demanding an amount of money large enough to threaten the financial future of the franchise if the ruling had gone the other way. The fact that the case rested so heavily on comparing exact creation dates shows just how much value that old, unpublished teaching comic from Hillenburg's classroom years ended up holding, long after he had left teaching behind entirely. Had Hillenburg never kept records or evidence of when he first created Bob the Sponge back in 1989, defending against this lawsuit could have looked very different. There is one more small but interesting detail connected to the show's naming choices worth mentioning here, since it shows how personal some of these decisions actually were for Hillenburg, even in cases with no legal stakes attached at all. When Hillenburg and his team eventually developed Plankton's wife and computer partner, a character named Karen, they chose that name directly in honor of Hillenburg's own wife, Karen Umland, whom he had married in 1998, just 1 year before the show premiered. This detail did not involve any dispute or legal concern, but it shows that even while surrounded by trademark issues and eventually an actual federal lawsuit, Hillenburg still found room to fold small, personal details into the world he was building, using character names as a quiet way of honoring people in his own life alongside the more practical, legally driven naming decisions forced onto the show by outside circumstances. Taken together, the story behind the show's name reveals two very different kinds of pressure Hillenburg had to work through before and after SpongeBob became a household name. Before the show ever aired, a simple trademark conflict with an unrelated mop product forced a quick rename, one that ended up shaping the character's entire identity in a way nobody could have predicted at the time. Years later, once the show had become genuinely successful, that same name and character became the target of a massive lawsuit built on a much bigger and far more serious claim, one that could have resulted in significant financial and legal consequences if the court had ruled differently. Both situations centered on the same basic question: who actually owned the idea of a cartoon sponge character? And in both cases, the answer ultimately depended on paperwork, timing, and evidence gathered years before anyone involved could have known how much it would eventually matter. What makes this entire chapter of the show's history stand out is how close both situations came to changing the show's fate in very different ways. A missed trademark check could have forced an embarrassing, last-minute rebrand right before the pilot aired. Or worse, an actual conflict with the mop company if the show had launched under the original name. A different outcome in the Walker lawsuit could have meant a massive financial judgment against Nickelodeon and Hillenburg personally, based on a character created years after Hillenburg's own original sponge design already existed on paper. Neither of these outcomes happened, but the fact that both were real possibilities, sitting quietly behind a show most people think of as lighthearted and harmless, adds a layer to the show's history that rarely gets any attention outside of legal records and old court filings. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. By the time this legal chapter closed, with the lawsuit dismissed and the show's name permanently secured, Spongebob Squarepants had already grown into something far bigger than Hillenburg's original modest expectations. Yet, even with the name and character legally protected, a different kind of threat to the show's future was already building. One that had nothing to do with courtrooms or trademarks at all, and everything to do with the decision Hillenburg himself was about to make regarding how much longer he wanted to keep working on the show he had built. Section 4. The first movie was supposed to be the ending. By the early 2000s, Spongebob Squarepants had grown from a small, uncertain pitch into one of the most popular shows on children's television, but very few viewers realized that its creator was already thinking about walking away from it. The story behind the first SpongeBob movie is not simply the story of how a cartoon made the jump to the big screen. It is the story of a planned ending that got overridden by a business decision, one that changed the entire direction of the show for years afterward. Talk of a SpongeBob movie began around 2001, when Nickelodeon and Paramount Pictures first approached Hillenburg about turning the show into a full-length film. At this point, the show had already built a strong following, and a movie made sense from a business standpoint, expanding a popular property into theaters while interest in the characters remained high. Hillenburg's first response to this offer was to turn it down. He was not interested in rushing into a feature film simply because the timing looked profitable, and he wanted the show itself to remain the main focus rather than diverting attention and resources into a separate movie project before he felt ready. That reluctance changed the following year. Once production wrapped on the show's third season, Hillenburg began actively developing the film concept in 2002. Shifting from resistance to genuine involvement in shaping what the movie would become. Around this same period, the show entered a production hiatus lasting roughly 2 years, largely because Hillenburg and much of his writing staff redirected their attention toward finishing the movie instead of continuing to produce new television episodes on the usual schedule. This gap meant that fans experienced a noticeably longer wait between new seasons than they had seen previously, though Nickelodeon used the pause to keep the third season running longer through reruns and expanded scheduling, softening the disruption from a viewer's perspective even as production behind the scenes had essentially paused. The film that eventually emerged from this development period carried the straightforward title The Spongebob Squarepants Movie. Hillenburg directed the film himself, marking his first time directing a full-length feature, while a separate director, Mark Osborne, handled the movie's live-action sequences, since the film blended traditional animation with real-world filmed footage in certain scenes. The writing credits reflected many of the same people who had shaped the show's earliest and most respected seasons, including Derek Drymon, the storyboard artist who had joined the project years earlier after chasing Hillenburg down a hallway to ask for a spot on the team, along with Tim Hill, Kent Osborne, Aaron Springer, and Paul Tibbett, a name that would soon carry much greater weight in the show's future than most viewers realized at the time. The voice cast brought back the show's established performers, including Tom Kenny, Bill Fagerbakke, Clancy Brown, Roger Bumpus, and Doug Lawrence, while adding a group of well-known outside actors for the film specifically. Alec Baldwin, David Hasselhoff playing a version of himself, Scarlett Johansson, and Jeffrey Tambor all joined the movie's cast, giving the project a bigger, more star-driven feel than the television series carried on its own. The plot centered on Mr. Krabs opening a second location of the Krusty Krab, with SpongeBob hoping to be promoted to manage the new restaurant. Instead, Krabs chooses Squidward for the position, explaining to SpongeBob that he still sees him as too young and immature to handle that level of responsibility. From there, the story expands into a much larger adventure, sending SpongeBob and Patrick on a journey to retrieve a stolen crown belonging to the ocean's ruler, a quest that eventually brings both characters up to the ocean's surface and into contact with the real world beyond Bikini Bottom, something the show rarely did on this scale during its normal television episodes. The film had its first public screening at Grauman's Chinese Theater on November 14, 2004, followed by its wide release across the United States on November 19th, distributed by Paramount Pictures. Made on a budget of around $30 million, the film ended up earning approximately $141 million at the worldwide box office, a strong return that confirmed the franchise could succeed well beyond a half-hour cartoon format. Critical reception was generally positive as well, with reviewers responding well to both the humor carried over from the show and the larger-scale adventure built specifically for the film. Bill Fagerbach, the voice actor behind Patrick, later described his own reaction to seeing the finished film, saying he found himself continually amazed and delighted by what the creative team had put together, a reaction that reflected how much bigger and more ambitious the movie felt compared to a normal episode. Despite this success, Hillenburg had a very specific plan for what this movie was supposed to represent within the larger story of the show. He intended for this film to serve as the series finale, closing out Spongebob Squarepants entirely once the movie reached theaters. His reasoning centered on a concern shared by many creators of long-running shows: the fear of continuing a series for so long that its quality and freshness start to decline, eventually reaching a point where the show keeps running purely out of habit rather than genuine creative purpose. Hillenburg wanted to avoid reaching that point with his own show, preferring to end things while the series still stood at a high point, rather than risk watching its reputation slowly wear down over additional seasons made without the same energy or focus. Nickelodeon did not share this plan. Once the movie proved successful both critically and financially, the network's interest shifted firmly toward continuing the show rather than ending it. Hillenburg later reflected on this tension directly, explaining that once the movie came out in 2004, there was a real concern among Nickelodeon's executives that the show may have already reached its peak popularity, and rather than treating that concern as a reason to end things on a high note the way Hillenburg wanted, the network's leadership treated it as a reason to keep the show running for as long as audience interest remained strong. From a business perspective, this made sense. The show had become an enormous source of revenue for Nickelodeon, generating income not just from the show itself, but from merchandise, toys, video games, and other licensed products connected to the characters. One of the show's longtime storyboard directors, Sam Henderson, later described the practical reality behind this decision plainly, noting that the show had become such a major source of income for the network that stopping production was simply not something Nickelodeon was willing to consider, regardless of how Hillenburg personally felt about the right time to end the story. Faced with a network unwilling to let the show conclude the way he had planned, Hillenburg made the decision to step back rather than continue running a show that no longer matched his original vision for where it should end. He resigned from his role as showrunner, the person responsible for overseeing the day-to-day creative direction of the series, and handed that responsibility to Paul Tibbitt, a writer who had already been closely involved with the show for years, including work on the very movie meant to close things out. Tibbitt had built a strong personal and professional relationship with Hillenburg throughout their years working together, making him a natural choice to take over guiding the show going forward. even though the circumstances behind this handoff were shaped more by a business decision overriding a creator's original plan than by any kind of natural, planned transition. Season 4 of SpongeBob SquarePants premiered on May 6, 2005, marking the first batch of new episodes produced entirely under Tibbett's leadership as showrunner. Hillenburg remained connected to the show from this point forward, but in a much smaller advisory capacity rather than his previous hands-on role. Rather than directly overseeing scripts, storyboards, and daily production decisions the way he had during the first 3 seasons, Hillenburg instead reviewed material and offered feedback to the production team from a distance, staying involved enough to maintain some connection to the show's direction without personally running it day to day the way he once had. He remained listed as executive producer across every season that followed, a title that continued even years after his death, but the direct, constant creative control he held during the show's earliest years effectively ended once Season 4 began production. This transition marked a genuine turning point in how the show looked and felt going forward, and it is worth understanding just how strong those first 3 seasons had been before this change took place. During its earliest years under Hillenburg's direct leadership, SpongeBob SquarePants became the highest-rated children's show on all of cable television, drawing more than 50 million viewers each month at its peak. The show earned a nomination at the Primetime Emmy Awards for Outstanding Children's Program during this same period, recognition that placed it among the most respected children's programming being produced at the time, not simply among the most popular. These first 3 seasons are widely regarded, even decades later, as the strongest stretch of the show's entire run, praised for sharper writing, a more consistent tone, and character dynamics that felt carefully built rather than repeated for the sake of filling additional episodes. Once Tibbett took over, the show continued for many more years, eventually running far longer than anyone involved in its earliest seasons likely expected. The new creative team, working without Hillenburg's constant day-to-day involvement, tried to hold on to the humor and character dynamics established during those first 3 seasons, but the overall direction of the show gradually shifted. Later seasons leaned more heavily into broader, more simplified humor aimed squarely at younger viewers, a shift that some longtime fans and critics felt moved the show away from the sharper, more balanced comedy that had made its earliest seasons connect with both children and older viewers at the same time. This is not a claim made only in hindsight by nostalgic fans looking backward. It reflects a genuine and noticeable change in tone that began right around the same production transition that placed Tibbett in charge following Hillenburg's decision to step back after the first movie. It would be inaccurate to describe this shift as an immediate collapse in quality, since the show maintained a large and dedicated audience for many years afterward, continued producing memorable episodes, and remained one of Nickelodeon's most valuable and recognizable properties throughout Tibbett's long run as showrunner. Still, the specific moment where this transition happened, right after a movie originally meant to end everything on a high note, represents one of the clearest points in the show's entire history where a purely creative decision, Hillenburg's wish to close the story deliberately rather than let it run indefinitely, ran directly into a business reality that the show had become too profitable for Nickelodeon to simply let go. Hillenburg's connection to the franchise did not end permanently after stepping back from his showrunner role. Years later, once a second SpongeBob film began development, he returned in a more active capacity than his advisory role on the television series had allowed. Announced publicly in 2012, with production confirmed in 2014, this second movie, eventually released as the SpongeBob movie Sponge Out of Water in February 2015, brought Hillenburg back as an executive producer who also contributed directly to the film's story. This return showed that Hillenburg had not lost interest in the world he built, even after deciding years earlier that the story, at least in his original vision, should have ended with the first film. Rather than staying completely separated from the franchise going forward, he found a way back into a meaningful creative role, specifically for a project built around a clear beginning and end, a film, rather than committing again to the open-ended, ongoing structure of a weekly television series that had originally pushed him to step back in the first place. Looking at this entire chapter together, the first SpongeBob movie represents a strange kind of turning point, a genuine creative and commercial success that succeeded so well it ended up overriding the very plan its creator built it around. Hillenburg wanted the movie to be a deliberate, well-timed conclusion to a story he had spent years building, from an old teaching comic into one of television's most recognized properties. Instead, its success became the reason Nickelodeon pushed to keep the franchise running far beyond that point, leading directly to a change in creative leadership that reshaped the show's tone and direction for over a decade afterward. None of this happened through any single dramatic event or public conflict. It happened through a quiet, practical business decision made by executives who saw a profitable, popular property and chose to keep it running rather than let a single film close the book on it, regardless of how carefully its creator had planned for that ending. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. One episode from these earliest, most respected seasons still stands out from every other episode the show ever produced, even decades after it first aired. And understanding why it holds that position requires looking closely at exactly what happened inside a single, tightly built story about a marching band that technically did not exist until the day it needed to perform. Section 5. The episode everyone agrees is the best, and why. Out of hundreds of SpongeBob SquarePants episodes made across more than 2 decades, one single half episode consistently gets named as the best the show ever produced. And the story behind how it actually came together involves far more luck and last-minute discovery than most viewers would ever guess. That episode is Band Geeks, the second half of the 15th episode of Season 2. And understanding why it holds this reputation means looking closely at both what happens on screen and the accidental way its most famous moment was actually created behind the scenes. Band Geeks originally aired on Nickelodeon on September 7, 2001, directed by Aaron Springer and written by C.H. Greenblatt, Aaron Springer, and Meriwether Williams. The premise is simple enough to explain in a single sentence. Squidward receives a phone call from an old high school rival named Squilliam Fancyson, a character introduced for the very first time in this episode, who brags about running a successful marching band. Caught off guard and unwilling to admit his own life has not turned out the way he hoped, Squidward lies and claims that he also leads a band. Squilliam then offers Squidward's supposed band a spot performing at halftime of a major sporting event called the Bubble Bowl, since Squilliam's own band will already be busy elsewhere that day. With no actual band to his name, Squidward is forced to scramble together a group of musicians from whoever happens to be available in Bikini Bottom, a group that ends up including SpongeBob, Patrick, Mr. Krabs, Sandy, Mrs. Puff, and even Plankton, none of whom have any real business being part of a serious musical performance. What follows is a stretch of chaotic rehearsal scenes built almost entirely around slapstick comedy and characters failing badly at playing instruments they clearly do not know how to use. The animation during these rehearsal sequences leans heavily on wide, exaggerated facial expressions and quick, jarring shifts between characters, mirroring the disorganized, painful sound of amateur musicians struggling to play together for the first time. Behind the scenes, sound designer Nicholas Carr built specific effects for these moments, including the high-pitched squeal of Squidward's clarinet and the crashing, off-key noise coming from instruments played badly during these rehearsal scenes. These sound effects were recorded at a studio called Hacienda Post and mixed carefully by Timothy J. Borquez to line up exactly with the animation, adding another layer of comedic timing on top of the already ridiculous visuals playing out on screen. The episode is also remembered for a specific back-and-forth exchange between Patrick and Squidward during one of these chaotic rehearsal scenes, where Patrick, holding a jar of mayonnaise, asks whether it counts as an instrument, only for Squidward to shoot the idea down flatly, adding that horseradish does not count as an instrument either. This kind of absurd, deadpan joke, treating a condiment as a serious question about musical instruments, captures the overall comedic tone running through the entire episode. Silly on the surface, but delivered with total sincerity by the characters involved. None of this chaos, however, is what made Band Geeks legendary. The moment responsible for turning this episode into the most celebrated half hour, or in this case, half episode, in the show's entire history, came together almost by accident during the final stages of production. Writer C.H. Greenblatt had already been handed a basic story outline for the episode directly from Steven Hillenburg, but the ending had not been settled yet. Greenblatt needed some kind of climactic piece of music for the band's actual performance at the Bubble Bowl, something powerful enough to justify the entire buildup of Squidward's disastrous rehearsals finally paying off. Working out of a small storage room inside Nickelodeon's studio in Burbank, Greenblatt began digging through a cabinet filled with production music, the kind of pre-recorded stock tracks television shows often license instead of writing brand new songs from scratch. Nothing he found matched what he was looking for, until he happened to put on an album called American Games, and heard a booming, dramatic voice come through the speakers. Greenblatt has described his reaction to hearing this voice as immediate amusement, imagining that exact sound coming out of a cartoon sponge, and realizing how funny and unexpected the contrast would be. A stadium rock voice nobody would expect from a children's show, suddenly powering its emotional climax. Excited by what he found, Greenblatt rushed into the office next door, belonging to Aaron Springer, the episode's director, to play him the track immediately. Springer reacted just as strongly, and the two of them quickly went to show Hillenburg what they had found, eventually convincing him this unexpected, oversized rock song was exactly what the ending needed. The song itself was called Sweet Victory, and its own history has almost nothing to do with SpongeBob at all. It was written in 1997 by David Glenn Isley, along with a co-writer named Bob Kulick, a guitarist whose brother, Bruce Kulick, played guitar for the well-known rock band Kiss. The song was created originally through a production music company connected to a larger recording arrangement with Arista Records, then formally released the following year through APM Music, appearing on an album titled American Games, designed specifically as a library of stock tracks meant for use in commercials, television shows, or other productions needing dramatic-sounding background music. Sweet Victory was never written with any specific show, movie, or event in mind. It existed purely as a generic, high-energy rock anthem sitting in a licensing catalog, available for any production willing to pay to use it, until a SpongeBob writer happened to stumble across it years later while searching for something completely different. David Glenn Isley, the singer behind the track, had a career stretching back well before this song existed. Born in 1952 in Los Angeles, Isley was the son of actor Anthony Isley, known for starring in the television series Hawaiian Eye during the late 1950s and early 1960s. Musically, Isley had already found real success years earlier as a member of the band Jufria, whose single Call to the Heart reached number 15 on the Billboard Hot 100 chart in early 1985. Beyond music, Isley also appeared in television shows including Beverly Hills 90210 and Seventh Heaven, along with a role in the 1988 film Action Jackson, giving him a career that touched acting as much as music before Sweet Victory ever existed as a project. When Greenblatt, Springer, and Hillenburg decided to use this song for the episode's climax, they built the entire final sequence directly around it, showing SpongeBob and the rest of the makeshift band suddenly transforming from a disorganized mess into a tight, synchronized, genuinely impressive musical performance in front of the Bubble Bowl crowd. Different characters were given specific instruments to match the moment, including Plankton on keyboard along with backing vocals, Mrs. Puff playing rhythm and bass guitar, and Mr. Krabs holding a keytar, a keyboard instrument worn like a guitar, while Pearl appears holding a saxophone during the performance, even though her playing is not actually audible in the final mix. The live-action footage used for the stadium crowd during this sequence was not created entirely from scratch either. Part of it came from real archival footage of a United States Football League game between the Memphis Showboats and the Tampa Bay Bandits, played on June 16, 1984, blended together with new footage filmed specifically for the episode, giving the sequence a scale and texture that felt far bigger than a typical half-hour cartoon segment. Once combined, the chaotic buildup of failed rehearsals, followed by this sudden, oversized, completely sincere musical performance, created a contrast that turned out to resonate with audiences far beyond what anyone working on the episode expected going in. The joke was never that the performance itself was bad or silly. The joke lived entirely in how seriously the moment played out, a booming, dramatic rock anthem performed with complete sincerity by a group of characters who, moments earlier, could not even hold their instruments correctly. That contrast between chaos and unexpected, genuine triumph became the exact thing viewers latched onto and kept returning to long after the episode first aired. The results of this unusual creative choice showed up quickly in how the episode was received. BandGeeks won a Golden Reel Award in 2002 in the category of Best Sound Editing for Television Animation, an honor recognizing the specific work put into building the episode's sound design, including both the chaotic rehearsal noise and the climactic musical performance itself. On IMDb, BandGeeks, along with its paired episode The Secret Box, holds the highest audience rating of any episode across the entire series, sitting at 9.7 or 9.8 out of 10, depending on when the rating is checked, based on thousands of individual votes from viewers. In November 2007, during a Nickelodeon special ranking the greatest moments across the network's entire history of animated shows, the Sweet Victory performance from BandGeeks was ranked as the single greatest Nicktoons moment of all time, beating out content from every other Nickelodeon cartoon ever produced up to that point. Critics writing about the show years later have consistently pointed to this same episode when discussing SpongeBob at its creative peak. Writers covering the show's 10th anniversary specifically highlighted this episode's handling of Squidward's arc, focusing on how the story built real emotional stakes around his failed rival relationship with Squilliam before resolving it through a moment of complete earned triumph, rather than a cheap or predictable ending. Other critics ranking the show's best episodes years later have placed BandGeeks at or near the very top of their lists, often specifically praising how tightly constructed the episode feels, moving quickly from setup through rising chaos into a genuinely satisfying and unexpected climax without any wasted time along the way. There is one additional detail connected to this episode's original broadcast that rarely comes up, even among longtime fans who know most of the episode's production history already. BandGeeks aired on September 7, 2001, just days before the September 11th attacks that same month, making it the final new SpongeBob episode to air before that event reshaped so much of American television and public life in the weeks that followed. This detail does not change anything about the episode itself, but it places this particular half hour at an unusual point in time, a moment of pure, uncomplicated comedic triumph broadcast right before a period when television across the country shifted dramatically in tone and focus for weeks afterward. Looking at everything behind this single episode together, the story of Band Geeks captures something true about how much of SpongeBob's best material came together through accident and instinct rather than careful, deliberate planning from the very beginning. Hillenburg handed over a story outline without a fixed ending. A writer went digging through a cabinet of unrelated stock music, simply hoping to find something usable. A song written years earlier for a completely different purpose, sitting inside a commercial licensing catalog, happened to catch someone's attention at exactly the right moment. None of these pieces were designed from the start to fit together this precisely. Yet once combined, they created a moment strong enough to be remembered as the single best thing the entire series ever produced. Still referenced, discussed, and replayed decades after it first aired on a random Friday in September. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That same moment, so beloved that fans spent years hoping to see it honored on one of television's biggest stages, eventually collided with real-world events far outside anyone's control, involving over 1 million signatures, a Super Bowl halftime show, and a reaction from fans that turned out to be far more complicated than anyone organizing that campaign ever expected. Section 6. The Super Bowl tribute fans misremember. A huge number of people who lived through February 2019 still believe, with total confidence, that Spongebob Squarepants actually performed at that year's Super Bowl halftime show. Ask around, and plenty of fans will describe watching Sweet Victory play out on the biggest stage in American television, treating it as a settled memory rather than something worth double-checking. The real sequence of events turned out to be far messier, far more complicated, and ultimately far less satisfying than what most people remember, or think they remember, happening that night. The chain of events leading up to this moment started with genuine tragedy. Stephen Hillenburg had revealed his ALS diagnosis in March 2017, and after a battle with the disease, he died on November 26, 2018, at the age of 57. Just 2 days later, on November 28th, a SpongeBob fan named Israel Kalunga posted a petition on the website change.org, calling for the song Sweet Victory, the same rock ballad that powered the unforgettable climax of the episode Band Geeks, to be performed during the Super Bowl 53 halftime show, scheduled for February 2019 in Atlanta. Kalunga framed the request explicitly as a tribute, describing it as a way to honor Hillenburg's legacy and his contributions to an entire generation of children who grew up watching his show. What happened next surprised almost everyone involved, including the two men who had actually written the song more than 20 years earlier. Within less than a week, the petition had already gathered more than 770,000 signatures, a pace of growth few online petitions ever reach. Momentum kept building steadily over the following weeks, eventually crossing 1 million signatures, and by the time the Super Bowl itself finally arrived, various reports placed the total number of signatures at roughly 1.2 million people, all asking for the same specific thing: a live performance of a song originally written for a stock music catalog, now being treated as a genuine cultural moment worth fighting for. This attention reached all the way back to the song's original creators. Sweet Victory was written in 1997 by David Glenn Isley, a hard rock singer who had previously fronted bands called Jufria and Dirty White Boy during the 1980s, alongside co-writer Bob Kulick, a guitarist whose past work included collaborations with musicians such as Lou Reed, the members of Kiss, WASP, and Michael Bolton. The song was released the following year, in 1998, through APM Music, a appearing on a production music album called American Games, part of the Bruton Music Library, a catalog built specifically to license generic, ready-made tracks to other productions, rather than being written for any single artist's personal album. Neither Isley nor Kulick had any connection to SpongeBob when they wrote the song, and both men later described being genuinely stunned by how much attention their 2-decade-old track had suddenly received because of the online petition. Kulick specifically noted that people who otherwise had no interest in the style of music he and Isley usually made would still instantly recognize Sweet Victory the moment they heard its name, a level of recognition neither of them ever expected from a song originally created for a licensing catalog rather than a specific audience. Encouraged by the growing attention, Isley and Kulick went so far as to re-record 2 brand new versions of the song ahead of the Super Bowl, one of which featured a full orchestra, hoping these updated versions might end up being used if the NFL decided to move forward with some kind of live performance. Both men stated publicly that they would be glad to perform the song themselves if given the opportunity, while also making clear that regardless of what actually happened, they wanted the song to stand as a genuine tribute to Hillenburg's memory, rather than simply another moment of Super Bowl entertainment. Anticipation continued building in the weeks leading up to the game itself. Maroon 5, the band selected to headline the Super Bowl 53 halftime show, was scheduled to perform alongside guest artists Travis Scott and Big Boi. Ahead of the show, Maroon 5's official social media account posted a teaser video previewing elements of their upcoming performance. And this teaser included a brief clip featuring SpongeBob, fueling widespread speculation that the show might actually deliver what so many fans had spent months hoping to see. When the actual halftime show aired live on February 3, 2019, at Mercedes-Benz Stadium in Atlanta, the reality turned out very different from what the build-up had suggested. Rather than any kind of full performance of Sweet Victory, viewers instead saw only a short clip referencing the Band Geeks episode, used briefly as a transition to introduce Travis Scott's performance of his song, Sicko Mode. The clip lasted only a few seconds, showing SpongeBob and the marching band setup from the episode before quickly shifting into Scott's separate musical segment. No live rendition of Sweet Victory happened at any point during the show. No cast member or musician performed the song on stage. The moment fans had rallied behind for months came down to a brief visual reference lasting only a handful of seconds, sitting inside someone else's performance rather than standing as its own moment. The reaction online afterward was intensely negative. Given how much build-up, media coverage, and genuine emotional investment had gone into the petition, many fans described feeling betrayed and deeply disappointed once it became clear that the actual tribute amounted to little more than a passing visual reference, rather than the full performance so many people had been hoping for. This response spread quickly across social media in the hours immediately following the show, with fans expressing frustration that a moment meant to honor Hillenburg's memory had been reduced to something so brief and disconnected from an actual musical performance. This is precisely where the common public memory of this event tends to drift away from what actually happened. Many people who remember this moment years later recall it as SpongeBob successfully performing at the Super Bowl, treating the years of petition coverage and the eventual brief clip as though they combined into an actual full-length performance. In reality, the closest anything came to a genuine, dedicated performance of the song happened away from the live broadcast entirely. After the game had ended, Sweet Victory was played in its entirety inside the stadium itself, accompanied by a dedication to Hillenburg's memory, giving the people physically present in Atlanta a fuller version of the tribute that the televised broadcast itself never delivered. Separately, in direct response to public complaints about how the halftime show handled the moment, the Dallas Stars, a professional hockey team, played the full version of Sweet Victory at their own arena during one of their games, offering their own version of the tribute that so many fans had wanted to see delivered on a bigger stage. Understanding why the actual halftime broadcast never included a full performance requires looking past simple explanations involving scheduling or performer preference. A detailed breakdown published shortly after the game laid out the layers of licensing and rights involved in getting a song like Sweet Victory cleared for a live Super Bowl performance. Bruton Metro Park, operating as part of APM Music, holds the role of publisher for the song, working through a performance rights organization called BMI, while a separate licensing arrangement allowed Nickelodeon's own music division to use the song directly through labels connected to Isley and Kulik, specifically for SpongeBob-related releases. Getting a song cleared for something as massive as a Super Bowl halftime show involves securing rights connected to composers and publishers, arranging appearance terms for whichever performers might be involved, and obtaining special licenses covering both the physical venue, a stadium holding around 70,000 people, and the broadcast network, reaching roughly 100 million television viewers. Even though the Super Bowl traditionally covers production costs for halftime performers, rather than paying standard appearance fees, the layered ownership structure behind a song originally created for a stock music catalog rather than a single dedicated artist or label, made clearing everything needed for a full-scale live performance considerably more complicated than casual fans following the petition likely realized. Beyond the halftime show itself, the broader wave of attention brought a meaningful outcome connected directly to Hillenburg's own illness. In January 2019, ahead of the Super Bowl, APM Music announced that it would donate a portion of the revenue generated by Sweet Victory to the ALS Association, the same disease that had taken Hillenburg's life just weeks earlier. Adam Taylor, president of APM Music at the time, spoke about how remarkable it felt watching a production music track cross over into mainstream awareness this dramatically, crediting both Hillenburg's original creative vision and the composers behind the song for creating something that resonated with so many people so many years after it was first written. This donation turned what could have simply been a viral music moment into something with a more direct, lasting connection to the very illness that had ended Hillenburg's life, tying the song's unexpected second wave of fame back to a cause connected specifically to his memory. The song's connection to the franchise did not end with this single controversial Super Bowl moment either. Sweet Victory continued appearing in later SpongeBob-related projects well beyond 2019, showing up during the finale of a Paramount Plus streaming promotion aired around Super Bowl 55, appearing again in the film The Cosmic Shake, both within its trailer and during the opening portion of its end credits, and later serving as the opening song for a special live broadcast tied to Super Bowl 58 in 2024, produced with its own unique animation style. This continued use shows that despite how disappointing the actual 2019 halftime moment turned out to be for so many fans, the song itself never lost its connection to the franchise or its cultural relevance, continuing to show up in official SpongeBob projects tied to major sporting events for years afterward. Taken as a whole, this entire episode says a great deal about how public memory can drift away from documented reality once enough time passes and enough retelling happens along the way. What actually occurred involved a genuine, heartfelt petition following a real, personal tragedy. A wave of media coverage and public anticipation that grew far larger than anyone involved originally expected. Two songwriters caught off guard by unexpected attention to a song they had mostly forgotten about. A brief and largely underwhelming clip buried inside someone else's Super Bowl performance. Immediate and widespread backlash from disappointed fans, and, eventually, a charitable donation and a handful of smaller, more complete tribute performances happening away from the main broadcast that most viewers never saw. Somewhere between all of these individual, well-documented pieces, popular memory simplified the entire story down into a single, cleaner version. One where SpongeBob simply performed at the Super Bowl, smoothing over just how disappointing and legally complicated the real outcome actually turned out to be. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. This gap between what people remember and what actually aired on television is far from the only place where the show's real history gets quietly reshaped or restricted after the fact. In a much less celebratory corner of the show's history, entire episodes have been pulled from circulation altogether, disappearing from broadcasts and streaming platforms for reasons that go well beyond a simple scheduling decision. Section 7. The episodes Nickelodeon won't show anymore. Out of every episode SpongeBob Squarepants has ever produced, only one has been permanently and completely pulled from circulation, disappearing from television reruns, streaming platforms, and future physical releases entirely. A second episode faced a temporary removal tied to unusual real-world timing rather than any lasting decision about its content. A third episode, despite years of public petitions demanding it be banned, was never actually pulled at all. Understanding the real difference between these three situations shows how much confusion exists around which SpongeBob episodes actually disappeared and why, compared to which ones simply generated controversy without any official response ever following through on removal. The clearest and most well-documented case involves an episode called Midlife Crustacean, which first aired on Nickelodeon on January 24, 2003, as the second half of the 15th episode in the show's third season, making it the 55th episode of the series overall. The episode was storyboard directed by C.H. Greenblatt and a writer known as Kaz, with additional writing credit going to Mark O'Hare. In the episode, Mr. Krabs realizes he is getting older and no longer feels young or exciting, prompting SpongeBob and Patrick to take him out for what they promise will be an entertaining night on the town. What follows involves a series of increasingly unimpressive activities, including a trip to a laundromat, picking up trash under a highway overpass, and a stop at a children's arcade restaurant, none of which managed to make Mr. Krabs feel any younger. Frustrated, he initially dismisses SpongeBob and Patrick, calling them immature, until Patrick reveals one final activity planned for later that night, something the show refers to as a panty raid, a term describing an old college prank from several decades earlier where groups would break into women's living spaces specifically to steal underwear as a kind of daring joke. Reinvigorated by the idea, Mr. Krabs agrees to join SpongeBob and Patrick for this final activity, and the three of them sneak into a house to take a piece of underwear from a woman living there. Mr. Krabs briefly celebrates, feeling genuinely youthful and rebellious for the first time all night, only to be caught red-handed by the homeowner, who turns out to be his own mother. SpongeBob and Patrick, it becomes clear, never actually told him whose house they were breaking into. As a direct consequence for lying by omission, Mr. Krabs' mother sends him to his old childhood bedroom and grounds him for the rest of the night, treating her adult son exactly like a misbehaving child. SpongeBob follows behind to apologize, and Mr. Krabs, rather than staying angry, admits that spending the night grounded in his old bedroom actually does make him feel younger again, closing the episode on a comedic note built around him accepting his punishment with unexpected good humor. When this episode first aired back in 2003, it drew only minor complaints from a small number of parents who felt the panty raid sequence promoted behavior resembling burglary, alongside content with a slightly suggestive undertone. Discussions that mostly played out on early internet forums that existed before more modern platforms became common. For roughly 15 years afterward, the episode continued airing in reruns without any official action taken against it, appearing across various international broadcasts and multiple DVD compilations, including a Season 3 collection released in November 2004 that specifically grouped together episodes centered on SpongeBob's work life at the Krusty Krab. That changed in 2018, when Nickelodeon quietly pulled Midlife Crustacean from its normal rotation of reruns entirely. When journalists eventually asked Nickelodeon directly about this removal, a representative for the network confirmed that the episode had been out of rotation since 2018, explaining that a standards review process had determined certain story elements were no longer considered appropriate for children. When pressed further on which specific scenes triggered this decision, and whether the network had considered adding a warning message before the episode instead of removing it completely, Nickelodeon's representative offered no further comment either time. Based on the plot itself, most people who have studied this removal point directly to the panty raid sequence as the likely reason behind the decision, given that it remains the episode's most obviously questionable moment by modern standards, even though the episode does show Mr. Krabs facing real consequences for his actions, rather than getting away with anything. The removal turned out to be far more permanent and thorough than many viewers initially expected. Midlife Crustacean is not available anywhere on Paramount+, the streaming service that otherwise carries the overwhelming majority of the show's full catalog. It does not appear on more recent physical DVD releases either, even though it remains present on some older, previously released box sets that predate the 2018 decision, including a complete first 100 episodes collection carrying a 2020 copyright printed on the packaging itself. An interesting contradiction showing how the removal applied moving forward without necessarily erasing every older physical copy already sitting on store shelves or in private collections. Beyond North America, the episode's availability became something of a patchwork depending on the country. It stopped airing entirely in the United Kingdom and Ireland following its removal elsewhere. Indonesia continued airing the episode, but with certain scenes cut. A broadcaster in Taiwan kept the episode on air while specifically removing both the panty raid sequence and the episode's ending. A streaming service operating across several Nordic countries carried the episode briefly between 2023 and 2024, before quietly removing it again, leaving its paired episode, The Great Snail Race, available on its own, without any acknowledgement of the missing second half. As of the most recent information available, Midlife Crustacean remains the only SpongeBob episode treated as permanently banned, with no indication that Nickelodeon plans to reverse this decision or return the episode to any of its platforms going forward. A separate and very different kind of removal happened years later, with an episode called Quarantined Crab, produced in 2019 and originally scheduled to air on Nickelodeon sometime in 2020 as part of the show's 12th season. In this episode, the Krusty Krab restaurant gets placed under an emergency quarantine after a mysterious illness starts spreading among the characters, and nobody can immediately figure out who is responsible for carrying it. Fearing the situation could spiral further out of control, Mr. Krabs resorts to increasingly extreme measures, including locking suspected carriers inside the restaurant's freezer, escalating the chaos until SpongeBob eventually steps in to help resolve everything. None of this plot would have raised any particular concern under normal circumstances, since the show had explored plenty of exaggerated, over-the-top storylines involving illness and panic in the past without any real-world consequence attached. The problem in this specific case had nothing to do with the content itself being newly considered inappropriate the way Midlife Crustacean's panty raid scene eventually was. Instead, the timing turned out to be the entire issue. The episode was originally scheduled to premiere in the United States as early as April 2020, right as the real-world COVID-19 pandemic was spreading rapidly across the globe, prompting widespread lockdowns, quarantines, and public anxiety that closely mirrored the exact kind of storyline playing out inside the episode itself. Rather than air a lighthearted comedy episode built around quarantine and contagious illness during a period when millions of real people were dealing with those exact circumstances in their own lives, Nickelodeon chose to pull the episode from its scheduled broadcast entirely, holding it back rather than airing it as originally planned. Nickelodeon confirmed this decision directly to journalists, explaining through an official statement that the episode's storyline centered on a virus and that airing it during a period marked by real sensitivities connected to an ongoing global pandemic did not feel appropriate at that specific moment. Unlike the situation with Midlife Crustacean, this delay was never framed as a permanent ban from the very beginning. Vincent Waller, one of the show's supervising producers, addressed the situation directly online, stating clearly that the episode had not been permanently shelved, and that it would very likely return to air once the pandemic had eased enough that its subject matter no longer felt uncomfortably close to real-world events still unfolding around viewers. While the episode waited for its eventual return to American television, it still found its way to audiences in other countries well before reaching the United States. A clip from the episode appeared on Nickelodeon's Latin American website as early as April 2020. The episode itself became available through video-on-demand services in France by May 2020, and it eventually reached Canadian audiences through a streaming release in November of that same year. Additional countries picked up the episode at various points throughout 2020 and 2021, meaning that international audiences had access to Quarantined Crab well before American viewers ever got the chance to see it through official channels. By early 2022, with pandemic restrictions loosening considerably and everyday life returning closer to normal across much of the country, Nickelodeon finally allowed the episode to air in the United States, more than 2 years after its original intended broadcast date. It premiered on April 29, 2022, paired alongside a separate segment called Who Are Zoo, itself an episode that had also faced its own smaller scheduling delays unrelated to pandemic concerns. Even after finally airing, Quarantined Crab continued facing certain restrictions that set it apart from a typical episode returning from a simple scheduling delay. It remained absent from the official Season 12 DVD release entirely, and it did not become available on Paramount Plus alongside the rest of the season until 2023, a full year after its actual television premiere, suggesting that even once Nickelodeon felt comfortable airing the episode on live television again, some lingering caution around the subject matter kept it out of certain other formats a while longer. Not every episode people associate with controversy or banning has actually faced any real action from Nickelodeon at all, and one particular episode illustrates this gap between public perception and documented reality especially clearly. An episode titled One Course Meal, which aired as part of the show's 7th season, focuses on Mr. Krabs discovering that Plankton is deeply afraid of whales, and using this fear against him by disguising himself as his own whale daughter Pearl, purely to torment his longtime rival. The torment escalates until Plankton, pushed to his emotional limit, appears to attempt something extremely serious involving stepping in front of traffic, a moment that struck many viewers as shockingly dark for what is otherwise a light-hearted children's program. Compounding matters further for critics of the episode, Mr. Krabs faces very little in the way of real consequences for his actions once the story wraps up. A sharp contrast to episodes like Midlife Crustacean, where the person causing trouble does receive a clear, direct punishment by the end. This episode has generated multiple public petitions over the years, hosted on platforms such as Change.org, specifically calling on Nickelodeon to pull it from circulation entirely due to how it handles this kind of serious subject matter inside a show aimed primarily at children. These petitions have consistently framed the episode as treating an extremely serious real-world issue as a punchline, expressing particular concern for young viewers who might not have the context or maturity to understand why this kind of content feels inappropriate, along with concern for any viewers, young or old, who may have personally experienced loss connected to this same subject in their own lives. Despite years of this kind of public pressure, and despite the episode consistently appearing near the top of lists ranking the worst episodes the show has ever produced, One Course Meal has never actually been pulled from Nickelodeon's rotation, removed from streaming platforms, or excluded from physical releases the way Midlife Crustacean eventually was. It does appear to air less frequently than many other episodes from the same era, though this reduced frequency may simply reflect its pairing with a separate segment built around a very specific Valentine's Day theme, making it a poor fit for general rotation outside of that particular time of year, rather than reflecting any official decision connected to the episode's more serious content. Taken together, these three examples show just how differently Nickelodeon has actually handled controversial content across the show's long history, despite how similar these situations might look at first glance from the outside. Midlife Crustacean received a genuine, permanent removal following an internal standards review, cutting it out of nearly every available format years after it originally aired without incident. Quarantined Crab faced a temporary, clearly explained delay, driven entirely by unfortunate timing connected to a real-world crisis, one that resolved itself naturally once enough time had passed and pandemic conditions eased. One Course Meal, despite ongoing public criticism and repeated organized campaigns asking for exactly this kind of action, has never received any official response from Nickelodeon at all, continuing to exist across the same platforms as any other regular episode from its season, regardless of how strongly certain viewers feel about its content. What ties all three of these situations together is a simple reality that gets lost easily in casual conversations about which SpongeBob episodes are banned. Real, documented removals are rare, specific, and usually confirmed directly by the network itself once journalists ask the right questions. Everything else, no matter how much public outcry surrounds it, remains simply controversial rather than officially restricted. A distinction that matters a great deal for anyone trying to understand the show's actual broadcast history, rather than relying on secondhand claims passed around without confirmation. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. This entire pattern of decisions, made specifically for American audiences, also overlooks something else worth understanding about how differently this same show gets treated once it crosses into other countries entirely, where completely different standards, completely different cultural expectations, and completely different broadcast rules shape which scenes survive and which quietly disappear before most international viewers ever get the chance to notice anything missing at all. Section 8. Different countries watch a different show. Spongebob Squarepants airs in more than 170 countries, and once a show reaches that many different markets, it stops existing as a single, fixed piece of media watched the same way everywhere. Different broadcasters across the world apply their own standards to the exact same episodes, resulting in versions of Bikini Bottom that look, sound, and sometimes even mean something slightly different depending on where in the world someone happens to be watching from. One of the clearest patterns shows up in the United Kingdom and Ireland, where broadcasters have repeatedly focused on editing flashing lights and rapid visual effects, rather than cutting entire jokes or storylines. This kind of edit exists mainly out of concern for viewers with photosensitive conditions, since certain patterns of fast, bright flashing on screen can trigger seizures in a small number of people sensitive to that kind of visual stimulation. In the Band Geeks episode, 3 separate scenes received this treatment for UK and Irish broadcasts. The explosion happening after the flag twirlers crash into a blimp during the episode's chaotic marching band buildup was slowed down specifically to reduce the intensity of its flashing lights, and 2 additional moments during the Sweet Victory performance itself received similar treatment, dimming or slowing the flashing stadium lighting effects that appear behind the band during their big musical number. None of the actual jokes, dialogue, or story content changed in these edits. The comedy stayed completely intact. Only the raw visual intensity of specific lighting effects was adjusted to meet local broadcast safety standards. A similar kind of edit affected the introduction sequence for a recurring segment inside the show called The New Adventures of Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy, a superhero parody that frequently appears within full-length episodes as its own separate mini-show. For UK and Irish broadcasts, this introduction was slowed down and darkened, and a comic book-style visual effect reading out a dramatic sound word was similarly adjusted to reduce its flashing intensity. Beyond flashing lights specifically, these same regions have also made edits connected to imitable behavior, meaning actions a young viewer might realistically try to copy at home. One clear example involves a scene where Spongebob excitedly looks into an oven at a piñata baking inside, a moment cut from UK and Irish broadcasts, likely due to concerns about young viewers associating ovens with anything other than their intended, supervised use. Beyond safety-related edits, an entirely different set of concerns shapes how the show gets handled once it reaches parts of the Middle East, particularly through the many Persian-language dubbed versions distributed across Iran and neighboring regions. Unlike most countries, where a single official dub typically exists for a given language, SpongeBob has been dubbed into Persian at least 8 separate times, produced by different companies with wildly different levels of official licensing behind them. Only 2 of these Persian versions carry genuine official licensing, one distributed through a channel called IRIB-TV2, covering 2 seasons of the show between 2011 and 2016, and a second produced by MBC Persia, which began covering the series starting around its 9th season. The remaining Persian dubs exist without proper licensing from the show's rights holders entirely, sometimes relying on quality that varies significantly from one release to the next, and in at least one documented case, actual footage taken directly from official Nickelodeon broadcasts gets reused, with the original television rating symbol covered up by an unrelated logo to disguise its origin. Content changes within these Persian versions reflect cultural and religious standards quite different from what shapes decisions made in places like the UK. A particularly well-documented example involves the character Sandy Cheeks, whose typical bikini-style diving suit gets replaced entirely in certain episodes with a purple dress, edited in frame by frame across specific episodes, including one centered on preparing for winter hibernation, and another built around a defensive training sequence between Sandy and other characters. This redesign reflects broader modesty standards common across parts of the region, where showing a female character in swimwear, even an animated non-human character, runs against local broadcast expectations in a way that a plain, fully covering dress does not. Beyond changes affecting Sandy specifically, one widely referenced case involving the MBC Persia dub documents a range of individual scene cuts made across various episodes, including a moment showing Mr. Krabs washing his boat in a way that reveals his bare backside, removed specifically due to concerns around sexual content, even though the scene itself was clearly intended purely as slapstick humor within the original English version. A separate and recurring pattern across several different countries involves scenes interpreted as suggesting romantic or same-sex relationships between characters, even in cases where nothing in the original English version was ever intended that way. One frequently cited example comes from an episode called The Fry Cook Games, where SpongeBob and Patrick are shown holding hands as they walk away from a wrestling arena together, a simple, friendly gesture within the context of the episode. In several countries, including some Persian dub versions, this scene gets cut or visually cropped entirely, based on an interpretation that reads the hand-holding as implying something romantic between the two characters, rather than simple platonic friendship, despite nothing in the original writing or animation supporting that reading. Commercial considerations, entirely separate from cultural sensitivity concerns, have shaped certain international edits as well. Early Italian broadcasts of an episode called Welcome to the Chum Bucket cut an entire musical sequence called This Grill Is Not a Home, most likely to make room for additional commercial breaks within a fixed broadcast time slot, rather than for any reason connected to the song's actual content. This kind of edit highlights a completely different motivation behind international changes, driven purely by business logistics around advertising revenue, rather than any concern about what young viewers should or should not see. Interestingly, Nickelodeon itself has occasionally made edits driven by concerns that have nothing to do with the original episode content at all, but instead relate to how certain scenes later became connected to unrelated internet content created entirely outside the show. One especially unusual example involves an episode called SpongeBob in Random Land, which included a brief visual reference resembling a specific internet-based horror story built around a disturbing, fan-made reinterpretation of Squidward's character. Once Nickelodeon's own standards team became aware of what this particular visual reference was connected to, the scene was removed entirely from the episode's UK broadcast, and later replaced in American reruns as well, with an entirely different, unrelated visual reference instead. This example shows that international and even domestic edits do not only respond to a scene's original intended meaning, but sometimes respond retroactively, once outside internet culture attaches a completely different, unintended meaning to a moment that originally aired without any controversy at all. Taken together, these examples paint a picture of a show that exists simultaneously as many slightly different versions of itself around the world, shaped by an overlapping mix of safety regulations, cultural and religious expectations, business scheduling needs, and even reactive decisions responding to how outside audiences have reinterpreted specific moments years after they originally aired. A viewer in the United Kingdom watching Band Geeks sees the same joke structure and the same core story as an American viewer, but with slightly dimmed flashing lights during the marching band's big finale. A viewer watching an unlicensed Persian dub might see Sandy in a completely different outfit than the one American audiences have always known, based on standards around modesty that have nothing to do with how the character was originally designed. A viewer catching an early Italian broadcast might miss an entire musical number altogether, cut simply to fit more commercials into a fixed time slot. None of these versions is more correct or more official than another in any absolute sense. Each one reflects a different set of local priorities layered on top of the exact same underlying show, built originally around one specific creative vision from a marine biologist turned animator working out of a Los Angeles studio decades earlier, now reshaped in dozens of smaller ways by broadcasters spread across every part of the globe. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. While all of these international versions kept spreading Bikini Bottom further and further across the world throughout the 2000s and 2010s, the man who built that world in the first place was living through the final years of his own life, largely away from the spotlight, facing a diagnosis that would eventually connect his personal story to the show in a way nobody watching at home could have anticipated. Section 9. The diagnosis he chose to announce himself. By the time most fans learned anything was wrong with Steven Hillenburg's health, he had already been living with a serious diagnosis for some time, and the way he chose to share that news with the public says a great deal about how he handled his final years, quietly, deliberately, and almost entirely on his own terms. For more than a decade before this point, Hillenburg had already settled into a much smaller, advisory role connected to Spongebob Squarepants, following his decision years earlier to step back from directly running the show after the first movie. He remained listed as executive producer throughout this entire period, occasionally reviewing material and offering feedback to the production team, but the daily creative control he once held during the show's earliest seasons had shifted permanently into Paul Tibbitt's hands, and later, other members of the production staff who continued guiding the series long after Hillenburg's most active years had passed. This arrangement had already been in place for roughly a decade by the time his health became a public matter at all. On March 13, 2017, Hillenburg made the decision to reveal his diagnosis directly to the entertainment publication Variety, rather than allowing the news to leak out gradually through rumors, unofficial sources, or a slow trickle of speculation, the way health-related news sometimes spreads through Hollywood. He was 55 years old at the time. In a statement shared with the publication, he explained that he wanted people to hear the news directly from him, confirming that he had been diagnosed with ALS, a serious and progressive disease affecting the nervous system. He made clear in this same statement that he intended to keep working on Spongebob Squarepants and on his other creative projects for as long as his health allowed him to continue, expressing gratitude for the support already pouring in from fans and colleagues, while also asking that his family's request for privacy be respected during this difficult period. Nickelodeon responded publicly as well, releasing its own statement describing Hillenburg as a brilliant creator who had brought joy to millions of fans, extending thoughts and support toward him and his family during what the network acknowledged was clearly a difficult time. The network's statement also noted that, out of respect for the family's wishes, no further comment would be offered beyond this initial response, a decision that matched the tone Hillenburg himself had set in his own announcement, focused on sharing the essential facts once, clearly, and then stepping back from further public discussion of the illness itself. ALS, formerly known as amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, and sometimes referred to by its more commonly recognized name, Lou Gehrig's disease, is a rare and serious condition that attacks nerve cells controlling voluntary muscle movement throughout the body. As the disease progresses, patients gradually lose the ability to control muscles needed for basic physical actions, even as their mental awareness and thinking ability typically remain completely unaffected throughout the entire course of the illness. According to figures from the ALS Association, roughly 15 new cases of this disease are diagnosed across the country every single day, making it a rare condition relative to the overall population, though one that affects a steady, ongoing number of new patients and families each year, regardless of that rarity. Life expectancy following diagnosis typically falls somewhere between 2 and 5 years on average, though a smaller number of patients have been known to live considerably longer, in some documented cases surviving more than a decade after their initial diagnosis. At the time this announcement became public, Hillenburg's continued involvement with the franchise had already been reaffirmed just 1 year earlier through a very ordinary, unrelated business decision. In March 2016, Nickelodeon had renewed Spongebob Squarepants for a 10th and 11th season, extending the show's run well past the 200-episode mark, a milestone reached without any indication that Hillenburg's health had become a factor in any of these ongoing decisions. This timing places his diagnosis squarely in the middle of a period where the show itself continued expanding steadily, entirely separate from whatever personal health challenges its creator was quietly managing behind the scenes at the exact same time. Hillenburg's own history with the ocean, the subject that had shaped nearly every creative decision behind his most famous work, remained something he clearly still valued even during this difficult period. In an interview given years earlier to the New York Times back in 2001, well before any health concerns entered the picture, Hillenburg had explained his original thinking behind choosing a sea sponge as his main character, describing his interest in building a show around an innocent character and settling on a sponge specifically because it struck him as a strange, funny kind of animal to build an entire show around. He described his early vision of the character as something nerdy and squeaky clean, a description that continued to match the tone of the show throughout its entire run, long after Hillenburg himself had stepped back from directly overseeing its daily production. Following his diagnosis, Hillenburg largely kept his health struggles away from public view, honoring the same request for privacy he had asked for directly in his original statement. Details about exactly how his condition progressed over the following year and a half remain limited, reflecting how successfully he and his family managed to keep this part of his life private, even while continuing to hold a position connected to one of the most publicly visible entertainment franchises in the world. This stands out as a notable contrast worth recognizing on its own. A man responsible for creating characters known globally for their loud, exaggerated, constantly public personalities, chose to handle the most serious challenge of his own personal life with almost the exact opposite approach. Quiet, controlled, and shared only on his own specific terms, rather than allowed to spread through public speculation. Steven Hillenburg died on November 26, 2018, at his home in San Marino, California, at the age of 57. Nickelodeon confirmed his death publicly, releasing a statement describing him as a beloved friend and longtime creative partner to everyone connected to the network, extending condolences directly to his entire family during this loss. The network's statement went further, describing how Hillenburg had filled Spongebob Squarepants with a distinctive sense of humor and innocence that had brought genuine joy to generations of children and families around the world. Language that reflected not just a formal corporate response, but a recognition of just how personally connected Hillenburg's own creative instincts had remained to the show throughout its entire history, even during the years he spent working in a reduced, advisory capacity rather than direct daily control. At the time of his death, Hillenburg was survived by his wife Karen, whom he had married in 1998, 1 year before Spongebob Squarepants first premiered on television. The couple had one son together, named Clay, also born that same year. Hillenburg was additionally survived by his mother, Nancy, and his younger brother, listed in various records as either Brian or Brian, who had followed their father's earlier career path into aerospace design work, rather than pursuing animation or marine biology themselves. Following his death, Hillenburg's body was cremated, and his ashes were scattered into the Pacific Ocean along the California coastline, a final resting place that connected directly back to the exact body of water that had shaped nearly every meaningful decision throughout his entire creative and professional life. From his earliest childhood fascination with tide pools, through his years teaching marine biology, and eventually into the fictional underwater world he spent decades building around that same lifelong connection to the sea. There is something worth sitting with in how differently Hillenburg's actual death was handled compared to the massive, highly public wave of tribute and attention that followed shortly afterward. His own announcement of his illness had been calm, direct, and specifically framed around a request for privacy. His death, by contrast, triggered one of the most visible, widely discussed public tribute campaigns connected to any television creator in recent memory, eventually pulling in over 1 million people, a major recording artist's halftime performance at the Super Bowl, and a charitable donation connected directly to the same disease that had taken his life. Hillenburg himself never lived to see any part of that public reaction unfold, having passed away months before the petition calling for a Super Bowl tribute to his memory was ever even created. This gap between Hillenburg's own quiet, controlled approach to his final years and the enormous, highly public response that followed his death captures something true about the relationship between a creator and the audience connected to their work. Hillenburg spent his entire career building something loud, colorful, and constantly public. A character known worldwide for exaggerated laughter and boundless enthusiasm. Yet the man behind that character handled the most difficult chapter of his own life with almost total restraint, choosing exactly what to share, when to share it, and making clear from his very first public statement that privacy mattered more to him than public sympathy or attention. The wave of tribute that followed his death, however well-intentioned, existed almost entirely outside anything Hillenburg himself ever asked for or anticipated. A public reaction shaped by millions of fans responding to the loss of someone whose actual final years remained, by his own explicit request, mostly hidden from the very audience mourning him so visibly. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Even after his death, Hillenburg's name and creative fingerprints continued appearing on new SpongeBob content for years afterward, connected to projects he had never lived to see completed, credited on episodes he had helped shape only in their earliest stages, and remembered through a body of work that kept expanding well beyond anything a single person's lifetime could have produced entirely on their own. Section 10. The creator never really left, even after death. Steven Hillenburg died in November 2018, yet in the years that followed, the SpongeBob Squarepants franchise did not slow down at all. If anything, the years after his death produced more new shows, more new movies, and more new content connected to Bikini Bottom than almost any other stretch in the franchise's entire history, all of it still carrying his name as creator, even on projects he had no direct hand in making. Season 13 of the main series, which premiered on October 22, 2020, became the first full season of SpongeBob Squarepants produced entirely without any involvement from Hillenburg whatsoever, marking a clear and permanent turning point in how the show operated moving forward. By this point, the show's day-to-day direction had already shifted away from Paul Tibbitt as well, since Tibbitt had stepped down from his showrunner role back in 2016, handing responsibility over to two other longtime crew members, Vincent Waller and Mark Ceccarelli, who continued running the show from that point onward, including through the entire period following Hillenburg's death. Despite none of these three men, Hillenburg, Tibbitt, or the show's earliest creative team, remaining directly involved by this stage, Hillenburg's name continued appearing on every new episode, film, and spin-off as creator and executive producer, a credit that persisted regardless of how much creative distance had grown between his original vision and the people now actually running the franchise. This same season also marked another significant shift, becoming the first season of the main show to air alongside brand new spin-off series built around the same core cast of characters. In June 2019, a computer-animated spin-off called Camp Coral, SpongeBob's Underyears, received the green light for production. Built around younger versions of SpongeBob, Patrick, Squidward, and the rest of the Bikini Bottom cast, attending a summer camp together as children rather than adults. The show eventually premiered on the streaming service Paramount Plus on March 4, 2021, later expanding to regular Nickelodeon broadcasts as well, and continued airing new episodes until July 2024. A second spin-off, The Patrick Star Show, was separately announced in August 2020, centered around Patrick hosting his own chaotic variety talk show alongside members of his family. This series premiered on Nickelodeon on July 9, 2021, and continued receiving new season renewals for years afterward, eventually reaching a fourth season that began airing in March 2025. Both of these spin-off shows continued crediting Hillenburg directly as creator, a credit technically accurate given that every character featured across both spin-offs originated from designs and personalities Hillenburg built decades earlier, even though he had no personal involvement in either show's actual production. This arrangement did not sit well with everyone connected to the franchise's history. Paul Tibbitt, the same person who had taken over as showrunner immediately following Hillenburg's own decision to step back after the first movie, spoke out publicly against the camp choral concept specifically, describing the idea of aging characters down into younger versions of themselves as a lazy, purely commercial move, rather than a genuine creative choice. Tibbitt went further, recalling a specific joke Hillenburg himself used to make years earlier, predicting that eventually, executives would push for exactly this kind of younger, aged-down spin-off concept, treating the very idea as something Hillenburg viewed skeptically, rather than something he ever actually wanted made. From Tibbitt's perspective, moving forward with Camp Coral after Hillenburg's death, given his own past comments dismissing this exact kind of project, showed a lack of respect toward the wishes of the person whose creative work the entire franchise still depended on. Nickelodeon's own leadership offered a different perspective on these same decisions. Brian Robbins, a producer who eventually became a top executive at the company, addressed this tension directly when discussing the spin-offs publicly, stating that staying respectful toward what Hillenburg had originally built remained an important consideration for the creative teams working on new projects, even without his direct involvement. This difference in perspective between a former showrunner who worked closely alongside Hillenburg for years, feeling that certain posthumous projects contradicted his creator's actual wishes, and network executives who felt they were honoring his legacy responsibly while expanding it, captures a genuine and unresolved tension running underneath the franchise's continued growth after his death. Reasonable people connected to the show's own history clearly viewed these choices differently, and nothing about the franchise's continued commercial success since then has fully settled which side of that disagreement was more accurate. Beyond television, the film side of the franchise expanded significantly during this same period as well. A third movie, titled The SpongeBob Movie, Sponge on the Run, was directed by Tim Hill and released in March 2021, continuing the theatrical side of the franchise years after Hillenburg's death, though he had contributed to earlier development work on this film before he passed away. This was followed by 2 movies released directly through the streaming service Netflix rather than in theaters. Saving Bikini Bottom, the Sandy Cheeks movie, premiered on Netflix in August 2024, specifically timed to mark the 25th anniversary of the original show's premiere back in 1999. A separate Netflix film, Plankton, the movie, followed in March 2025, focused specifically on the show's longtime tiny villain rather than SpongeBob himself. A 6th theatrical film, titled Search for Squarepants, then reached theaters in December 2025, continuing to expand the franchise's film side more than 7 years after the man who originally created every character involved had already passed away. The stage side of Hillenburg's creative legacy had actually reached one of its biggest moments while he was still alive, though its full afterlife continued well beyond his death as well. Spongebob Squarepants, the musical, officially opened on Broadway at the Palace Theater on December 4, 2017, following an earlier world premiere production staged in Chicago the year before. The production earned 12 Tony Award nominations that season, tying with a separate musical, Mean Girls, for the highest number of nominations given out that year, covering categories including Best Musical, Best Direction, Best Choreography, and several nominations connected to its lead performer, Ethan Slater, who originated the role of SpongeBob on stage. Despite this large number of nominations, the production ultimately won only a single Tony Award, recognizing David Zinn's elaborate, imaginative set design work bringing Bikini Bottom to life inside a physical Broadway theater. The show closed on September 16, 2018, just over 2 months before Hillenburg's death, having run for roughly 9 months on Broadway to generally positive reviews from critics, even though its box office performance never fully matched the scale of attention and nominations the production received. Rather than disappearing entirely once its Broadway run ended, the production later returned in a different form, filmed specifically for television, with much of its original cast still involved, airing on Nickelodeon in December 2019 as a special presentation, letting audiences who never saw the Broadway show experience a version of the same stage production from home. Taken together, everything released across television, film, and theater in the years surrounding and following Hillenburg's death shows a franchise that grew significantly larger and more complicated than the show he originally built and directly oversaw during its first 3 seasons. What began as a single half-hour cartoon based on an old teaching comic drawn for a handful of marine biology students eventually expanded into a multi-show universe spanning the original series, 2 separate spin-offs, 6 theatrical or streaming films, and a Broadway musical adaptation, all still carrying his name as creator across every single piece of it, regardless of how much or how little he personally contributed to any specific project. This continued expansion raises a genuine question worth sitting with, honestly, rather than glossing over. A creator's name staying attached to a franchise long after their death is common practice across entertainment, and it reflects a real, legitimate connection back to whoever built the original characters and world in the first place. At the same time, someone like Paul Tibbitt, who spent years working directly alongside Hillenburg and understood his actual creative instincts and preferences firsthand, clearly believed that not every decision made under Hillenburg's name after his death actually matched what Hillenburg himself would have wanted made. Both of these things can be true simultaneously. The franchise legitimately traces every single character and setting back to Hillenburg's original creative work, stretching all the way back to an unpublished comic book drawn for tide pool ecology lessons decades earlier, while also having grown, after his death, into shapes and directions that at least one person who knew him personally and professionally has stated publicly he likely would not have approved of himself. What remains true regardless of that internal disagreement is the sheer scale of what grew out of one marine biology teacher's decision to turn his classroom drawings into a television pitch back in the 1990s. A show that Hillenburg himself once expected might last only a single season before quietly disappearing, instead became one of the longest-running animated series in American television history, spawned multiple successful spin-off shows, generated 6 feature films across theatrical release and major streaming platforms, and even reached Broadway, earning recognition among the top nominated productions of its entire season. Every one of these achievements traces back to the same starting point: a former marine biology teacher who once brought home dying tide pool creatures as a curious child, who spent his teenage summers frying food and boiling lobsters at a small restaurant in Maine, and who eventually turned an old classroom comic book, created purely to help a handful of students understand life along the California coastline, into one of the most recognized and continuously expanding entertainment franchises in the world. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.